The Ideal of Human Unity, Chapter 3, The Group and the Individual. It is a constant method of nature, when she has two elements of a harmony to reconcile, to proceed at first by a long continued balancing, in which she sometimes seems to lean entirely on one side, sometimes entirely to the other, at others to correct both excesses by a more or less successful temporary adjustment and moderating compromise. The two elements appear then as opponents necessary to each other, who therefore labor to arrive at some conclusion of their strife. But as each has its egoism, and that innate tendency of all things which drives them not only towards self-preservation, but towards self-assertion, in proportion to their available force, they seek each to arrive at a conclusion in which itself shall have the maximum part, and dominate utterly, if possible, or even swallow up entirely the egoism of the other in its own egoism. Thus the progress towards harmony accomplishes itself by a strife of forces, and seems often to be no effort towards concord or mutual adjustment at all, but rather towards a mutual devouring. In effect, the swallowing up, not of one by the other, but of each by the other, so that both shall live entirely in the other and as the other, is our highest ideal of oneness. It is the last ideal of love, at which strife tries ignorantly to arrive. For by strife one can only arrive at an adjustment of the two opposite demands, not at a stable harmony, a compromise between two conflicting egoisms, and not the fusing of them into each other. Still, strife does lead to an increasing mutual comprehension, which eventually makes the attempt at real oneness possible. In the relations between the individual and the group, this constant tendency of nature appears as the strife between two equally deep-rooted human tendencies, individualism and collectivism. On one side is the engrossing authority, perfection, and development of the state. On the other, the distinctive freedom, perfection, and development of the individual man. The state idea, the small or the vast living machine, and the human idea, the more and more distinct and luminous person, the increasing God, stand in perpetual opposition. The size of the state makes no difference to the essence of the struggle, and need make none to its characteristic circumstances. It was the family, the tribe, or the city, the polis. It became the clan, the caste, and the class, the kula, the gens. It is now the nation. Tomorrow or the day after, it may be all mankind. But even then, the question will remain poised between man and humanity, between the self-liberating person and the engrossing collectivity. If we consult only the available facts of history and sociology, we must suppose that our race began with the all-engrossing group to which the individual was entirely subservient, and that increasing individuality is a circumstance of human growth, a fruit of increasing conscious mind. Originally, we may suppose, man was altogether gregarious, association his first necessity for survival. Since survival is the first necessity of all being, the individual could be nothing but an instrument for the strength and safety of the group. And if we add to strength and safety growth, efficiency, self-assertion, as well as self-preservation, this is still the dominant idea of all collectivism. This turn is a necessity born of circumstance and environment. Looking more into the fundamental things, we perceive that in matter, uniformity is the sign of the group. Free variation and individual development progress with the growth of life and mind. If then we suppose man to be an evolution of mental being in matter and out of matter, we must assume that he begins with uniformity and subservience of the individual, and proceeds towards variety and freedom of the individual. The necessity of circumstance and environment, and the inevitable law of his fundamental principles of being, would then point to the same conclusion, the same process of his historic and prehistoric evolution. But there is also the ancient tradition of humanity, which it is never safe to ignore or treat as mere fiction, that the social state was preceded by another, free and unsocial. According to modern scientific ideas, if such a state ever existed, and that is far from certain, it must have been not merely unsocial, but antisocial. It must have been the condition of man as an isolated animal, living as the beast of prey, before he became, in the process of his development, an animal of the pack. But the tradition is rather that of a golden age, in which he was freely social without society, not bound by laws or institutions, but living by natural instinct or free knowledge. He held the right law of his living in himself, and needed neither to prey on his fellows, nor to be restrained by the iron yoke of the collectivity. We may say, if we will, that here poetic or idealistic imagination played upon a deep-seated race memory. Early civilized man read his growing ideal of a free, unorganized, happy association into his race memory of an unorganized, savage, and antisocial existence. But it is also possible that our progress has not been a development in a straight line, but in cycles, and that in those cycles there have been periods of at least partial realization, in which men did become able to live according to the high dream of philosophic anarchism, associated by the inner law of love and light and right being, right thinking, right action, and not coerced to unity by kings and parliaments, laws and policings, and punishments, with all that tyrant unease, petty or great oppression and repression, and ugly train of selfishness and corruption, which attend the forced government of man by man. It is even possible that our original state was an instinctive animal spontaneity of free and fluid association, and that our final ideal state will be an enlightened, intuitive spontaneity of free and fluid association. Our destiny may be the conversion of an original animal association into a community of the gods. Our progress may be a devious round leading from the easy and spontaneous uniformity and harmony which reflects nature to the self-possessed unity which reflects the divine. However that may be, history and sociology tell us only, outside the attempts of religious or other idealisms, to arrive either at a free solitude or a free association of man as an individual in the more or less organized group. And in the group there are always two types. One asserts the state idea at the expense of the individual. Ancient Sparta, modern Germany. Another asserts the supremacy of the state, but seeks at the same time to give as much freedom, power, and dignity as is consistent with its control to the individuals who constitute it. Ancient Athens, modern France. But to these two has been added a third type, in which the state abdicates as much as possible to the individual, boldly asserts that it exists for his growth, and to assure his freedom, dignity, successful manhood, experiments with a courageous faith, whether after all it is not the utmost possible liberty, dignity, and manhood of the individual, which will best assure the well-being, strength, and expansion of the state. Of this type, England has been, until recently, the great exemplar. England rendered free, prosperous, energetic, invincible by nothing else but the strength of this idea within her, blessed by the gods with unexampled expansion, empire, and good fortune, because she has not feared at any time to obey this great tendency and take the risks of this great endeavor, and even often to employ it beyond the limits of her own insular egoism. Unfortunately, that egoism, the defects of the race, and the exaggerated assertion of a limited idea, which is the mark of our human ignorance, have prevented her from giving it the noblest and richest possible expression, or to realize by it other results which the more strictly organized states have attained or are attaining. And in consequence, we find the collective or state idea breaking down the old English tradition. And it is possible that before long the great experiment will have come to an end in a lamentable admission of failure by the adoption of that Germanic discipline and efficient organization towards which all civilized humanity seems now to be tending. One may well ask oneself whether it was really necessary, whether by a more courageous faith, enlightened by a more flexible and vigilant intelligence, all the desirable results might not have been attained by a new and freer method that would yet keep intact the Dharma of the race. We must again note one other fact in connection with the claim of the state to suppress the individual in its own interest, that it is quite immaterial to the principle what form the state may assume. The tyranny of the absolute king over all, and the tyranny of the majority over the individual, which really converts itself by the paradox of human nature into a hypnotized oppression and repression of the majority by itself, are forms of one and the same tendency, each, when it declares itself to be the state, with its absolute l'état c'est moi, is speaking a profound truth, even while it bases that truth upon a falsehood. The truth is that each really is the self-expression of the state in its characteristic attempt to subordinate to itself the free will, the free action, the power, dignity, and self-assertion of the individuals constituting it. The falsehood lies in the underlying idea that the state is something greater than the individuals constituting it, and can, with impunity to itself and to the highest hope of humanity, arrogate this oppressive supremacy. In modern times, the state idea has, after a long interval, fully reasserted itself, and is dominating the thought and action of the world. It supports itself on two motives. One appeals to the external interest of the race, the other to its highest moral tendencies. It demands that individual egoism shall immolate itself to a collective interest. It claims that man shall live not for himself, but for the whole, the group, the community. It asserts that the hope of the good and progress of humanity lies in the efficiency and organization of the state. Its way to perfection lies through the ordering by the state of all the economic and vital arrangements of the individual and the group, the mobilization, to use a specious expression the war has set in vogue, of the intellect, capacity, thought, emotion, life of the individual, of all that he is and has, by the state, in the interest of all. Pushed to its ultimate conclusion, this means the socialistic ideal in full force, and towards that conclusion humanity seems to be heading with a remarkable rapidity. The state idea is rushing towards possession with a great motor force and is prepared to crush under its wheels everything that conflicts with its force or asserts the right of other human tendencies. And yet, the two ideas on which it bases itself are full of that fatal mixture of truth and falsehood, which pursues all our human claims and assertions. It is necessary to apply to them the solvent of a searching and unbiased thought which refuses to be cheated by words. If we are not to describe helplessly another circle of illusion before we return to the deep and complex truth of nature, which should rather be our light and guide.